attach a guest user to a permission set, which may have like view all and modify all permissions. Now, read and create is still allowed for anonymous guest users. So still there's a interesting attack vector from a security perspective that if you can read data and create data, it still can cause concerns for a Experience Cloud installation. So that's it for the security bit of the presentation. If you have any questions, we can address those. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to Paul.
Thank you, Waqas. Any questions, anyone?
Yep, sorry, thank you. I was on mute to say thank you. Thank you, Waqas. So I was trying to take a screenshot so I could share at work tomorrow. Good stuff. All right. All right, so next 2 months, we have 2 other good sessions coming up. Sunil Anam is going to be talking to us about CPQ development fundamentals. I was hoping he'd be here tonight. I'm going to have to give him a hard time. And then in July, Amit Chaudhry of Apex Hours is going to be giving us a security and permissions that every dev should know. So looking forward to having that session in July also. So make sure you sign up if you're interested in those topics. They should be good. I think that is all we have. Stephan, thank you again for traveling all the way from, where do you hail from? I want to say Vegas. Okay, good, I was right. So, yeah, are you going to do that? Come on down, or do I? How do you want to work this? Should be co-host. My microphone is going right here. You're sharing, so this is your audio. That's your okay. I won't go very far.
How is the sound here?
It's good. It's good.
Great. Okay. Fantastic. It's going into there.
It's microphone here, speaker there.
Mic here, speaker there. So we should be good. Okay. Cool.
I'm just going to stay here to tech support. So
and that's fine. Or you can do the presentation as well. And I will turn on my camera so that you can all see me while I'm talking, even though you might not be able to. But okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending in person or virtually. Our prestigious audience here has lots of pizza that they will be taking advantage of. But more importantly, we're here to talk about some really cool Salesforce stuff that is probably one of the coolest things I've seen to come out of Salesforce since I joined a few years ago. And that is the new Apex SDK for Slack. I could get a little show of hands on the screen or in the room. How many of you either use Slack at your company or personally, or your customers use Slack? I see a couple of hands raised in person and on the Zoom call, so that's fantastic. Slack is a really cool proposition because it's used by communities, it's used by companies, it's used by shadow IT inside of companies. There are very small groups inside of some companies that will have access to Slack, and it's not necessarily used very widely as this huge enterprise solution. And so I find that this gives us an opportunity to really bring together what Salesforce and Slack have to offer. And there's a whole big team here at Salesforce working on that problem and how we can bring it together. Now, before I get into any of it, we will be talking about a lot of forward-looking things today. So please make any purchasing decisions based off our currently available products and features, and not any of the cool new stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. And so we're going to be going through sort of what that Slack and Salesforce proposition looks like, what the anatomy of a Slack app is, and then how the Apex SDK for Slack really enhances the way that you can start interacting with Slack as a Salesforce developer. And then we'll have time for some Q&A afterwards. And so kicking it off with Salesforce plus Slack. So there are really 2 areas that we're trying to innovate when it comes to bringing Slack and Salesforce together. The first of those is from a low-code perspective, and actually bringing the power of flow and screen flows into Slack as well as allowing you to communicate to and from Slack with Flow. And then we have the Apex SDK for Slack, which allows you to build Slack apps in core Salesforce. And so when we talk about what Flow in Slack looks like, we won't touch on this too much because we want to get into the code, but it allows you to launch screen flows inside of Slack, collect input from users in Slack, and deliver flows directly to users, whether that be in a message or a channel. And the way that it works is you have a flow that you want to expose into Slack. You have to enable it as a flow for Slack with the checkbox. And what that actually does is create an action for you in Flow that you can then bring into the palette. And then via a record triggered flow, you can then trigger that Slack action in your action palette that will then take that screen flow and deliver it to a user in Slack or into a channel, wherever it's been targeted at. There are also some really cool Slack actions that will come out of the box in Flow as well, so that you can then go and grab things like the ability to create a Slack channel, to invite users to that channel, to pin a Slack message, send a Slack message, edit actions, and all kinds of cool stuff that you can use to really bring Slack into the Salesforce UI as part of your automation process. And like I said already, screen flows in Slack, you can take those same screen flows that you have being rendered in your Salesforce UI and render them in Slack. There's not a lot that you have to do. You literally just have to enable it and fire off the action. This will be going into beta this summer. However, it's worth noting that the only field types that you are going to have are display text and radio buttons. And so it's more for surveys, Q&A. There's not a lot of really heavy transacting against Salesforce that you can do around. I mean, you can do lookups via the pick list selections, but you can't provide values into the screen flow as it appears in Slack. But we'll render in that block kit UI, which we'll kind of get into in a little bit. And this is stuff that's going to be coming out of the box with every Salesforce license. If you have Slack, you can go and accept the terms and conditions, and you can start doing this stuff. But what's really cool, and the most important thing, and why we're all here, is the Apex SDK for Slack. It allows you to fully interact with your Salesforce org from Slack and vice versa. You can listen to events that are fired from Slack. You can create modals. You can post messages. And you can really control everything that you need to in Slack from Salesforce. And it uses the Salesforce security model. So any transaction that you're running in the Apex SDK is happening in Apex, which means that you have all of the default security settings in Apex when that transaction is running. However, it is worth keeping in mind that if you're opening up data into something like a channel that may have hundreds of users, thousands of users in the channel, they will see all of the data that's come back for the person who's ran an action or posted that data into the channel. So you do have to keep security in mind when you're building a lot of this stuff, because it's all being ran as the user who's initiating the action. And so their security preferences and permissions are the ones that are used by default when running the Slack application. So taking a step backward, what is a Slack app? Well, has anyone here used an app like Google Calendar in Slack, or Poly, or we use Workday a lot? I always use it to go and check my employee ID because it's much easier than logging into Workday, if I'm totally honest. Those are examples of ways that companies will build an application on top of Slack to keep you inside of Slack. And I think that's one way to sort of look at how the Apex SDK can help. It helps offload some work tasks into Slack that may be related to Salesforce. Some research has shown that a sales rep is much more likely to log a task from Slack than log into Salesforce, go find the record, and log the task. And so if you could find those types of actions and activities within your business or within one of your clients, offload that work into Slack, you might have a better chance of actually collecting those data points from inside of the Slack workspace. I mean, for us here at Salesforce, we use Slack religiously. I'm in Slack most of the day. And being able to do little things like that, have all of my Google Calendar notifications push through to remind me like 5 times that I'm late for a meeting is very helpful. And you can start doing that with Salesforce. Now, the way that Slack apps traditionally work are you have a user who's interacting with Slack, okay? And Slack has a very robust set of APIs that you can use to then hook into. you then have to have a application living on a server somewhere to listen to those API calls. And so when you're creating your Slack app, it may be getting installed into your environment, but the actual app is living somewhere else. For example, we have a lot of demos around how you can build a Slack app, deploy it to Heroku, and then install it into your Slack environment. However, you're still having to transact against whatever application or server you have running elsewhere that may need a data store. It may need this and it may need that. And it does take a lot of work to actually set that up and get it running and hook it into your Slack environment with no out-of-the-box security controls. You've got to write it all from scratch yourself. Yep.
So I think that Heroku, GCP, and AWS are also options for hosting code. It's not just Heroku. Okay. Whatever ecosystem you're in, you can land code there and have it become your Slack.
Yep. In fact, if I'll skip a couple of slides. I know I don't have it in here. There's a framework called Bolt that you can use to build Slack apps in JavaScript, Python, and I think Java, as well as there are other SDKs available that you can use to build Slack apps. They all work the same way. They just hook into the APIs that are provided by Slack. Okay. Yep. So when we talk about what those APIs are, the first one that we're going to highlight is the Events API. Every time that something happens in Slack, there is an event fired. There are about 50 different events that are fired. For example, when someone joins a channel, when someone leaves a channel, when a channel is renamed, every time someone sends a message, whether that be into a channel, into a group, into a DM, and the list just goes on and on and on. And you can listen to and respond to each of those events. And when that event is sent, you can then take in the context of that event, whether that be the channel that a message was sent to, the user who sent the message. You get all of the context about that, including the details of the message. One of my favorite ones is the reaction event. So every time someone adds an emoji to a message, an event is fired containing the context of that message and the event. And so you can then intercept that in your Slack app and do something with it. And so events are one great way to process and respond to transactions that are happening in Slack. Okay. The next one is the web API. And so you can actually hook into the Slack APIs and get information by querying a channel for all of its messages, or a user for all of the history of messages that they've sent. You can post messages, you can get info from users, and you can post as bots. And so you can use that. Oh, we've lost.
So
something.
I'm projecting.
Yep.
And so I needed to plug in so that you wouldn't lose that. And it's
cool. Everyone's still got me online now, correct?
yes, yeah. This seems to still be working. All I've done is muck up the screen. Can I have you take over projecting?
Yep, of course.
That. Take that out. Sorry about that. I didn't want the everything to die midstream.
That's okay. Okay, we should have me in the room now.
Yep. You are now presenting.
There we go. Cool.
Okay.
I apologize for that. You'll get a little bar at the top, but everyone at home does not. Yep. So pretty much in this context, by the web API, you can do stuff like send messages as a user or as a bot, create channels, add people to channels, and do all kinds of cool stuff with that bot user and actually posting and pushing stuff into Slack. Okay, and then lastly, we have BlockKit, which is all about creating surfaces. And when we talk about a surface, that's the content that you're sending into Slack, whether that be a message in a card, whether that be a modal, whether that be just a message, a standard message itself, images, whatever. You are creating surfaces, and those surfaces are written in what's called BlockKit. And BlockKit takes just a JSON format with your content and will render it into the Slack user interface. And so I've got a link here, and I'll actually open that up real quick for you to see. This is the BlockKit builder, and it allows you to create blocks here and identify how you would like your Slack message to render. You can then populate it with content and display a nice, pretty interactive message for your user. So for example, these are all of the components that are available in the Slack design system for you to then use. So for example, if you want to bring a header onto the page, date pickers, input components, etc. This gives you a great idea of what those are and what you can then bring into the UI, whether that be into your surfaces in a channel or into the modal or into your app's homepage. Okay, and this pretty much defines how that UI will look and feel and how you can interact with it. Full screen. Okay, yeah, and that's the block builder. So you can go in and build your blocks, and there are many different ways to do it. Now, how does this all work with Salesforce? Well, you don't need that middleware anymore. Okay, Salesforce is the server that is hosting your Slack application, and it's hooking into your Salesforce project. I know we've already seen the screen, but I just want to reiterate, like, we are abstracting the need for a third-party server to run your app. It is ran and hosted in your Salesforce org with your Salesforce org's authentication for users. And so the way that this works is we have Slack that has auth mapping, #1 for your org. So when you install the app, the admin then is required to authenticate to the Salesforce org. And then every user that wants to use the Slack app can then connect their user into Slack. And you have a Slack user mapping in your personal settings. And so each user that auths to the app is then mapped one-to-one to a Slack user. And then they can then take action against this. If they have the correct permissions, it will then run the app around what their permission sets are, etc. Okay. Now it's worth noting there are a couple of things that you can do out of the box, and those are listen to events. #1, you can create shortcuts in Slack, which are the little messages that you can click to pop up and run an action, or write / commands, which allow you to trigger an action based on what you've typed into the toolbar. And so for example, I have a workspace here. I can click on my shortcuts and see all of the shortcuts that exist in this org. And I can then use them to do something, or I can type in a / command here, like this get connected one that allows me to get connected to my Salesforce org. And those are all defined in Salesforce, but we'll go into that in a minute. And then we can also define those views. So we can define that block kit in Salesforce as well, so that we have a nice formatted message that we can send back to a user. Okay, and this all happens in your SFDX project. Okay, inside of Force-App, you will have your Apex classes that you can use in your Slack app. You have to assign a permission set to be able to access the Slack app. You then have a Slack app file, so a .slack app in your directory, and then you have your view definitions for crafting those surfaces that you can then send into your users. And that all exists within your Salesforce project, which I think is really cool. The fact that you can scaffold all of this directly inside of Salesforce. So that's enough with slides. Let's look at how all of this works. Okay, and so I have an SFDX project here for an app that I'm building for the App Exchange that does a lot of really cool Slack stuff. But let's take a look at some of the files themselves before I get into what it's actually doing. And so, like I said, the first thing that we have here is our Slack app folder. And in here, we have our Slack app. And this is really cool because it pretty much uses YAML to define what we want this app to do. So I've got a series of commands. You saw a second ago when I typed in that get connected command, that is running directly here from my Slack app. I can then point that command at an Apex class that will run every time someone hits that / command. And pretty much all it's doing is going and getting a message to send back to the user, but what it's doing is checking and ensuring that they are actually connected to the Salesforce org. And I'm able to run and hit that / command every time someone types it in. You can see here, I also have shortcuts. And so I've got a shortcut here that launches flows, which we'll go through in a minute. And then I have some events, and that's where we're going to start, is with the events. And so what I've done here is I'm listening to the app home opened event, the file shared event. Every time a member joins a channel, leaves a channel, sends a message, and adds a reaction. And what I'm doing is just calling a very generic Apex class here. That's an event handler that's going to handle the events that are coming in from Salesforce or from Slack. And when I connect this app into my org, you can see here, I've got the app set up here, my Salesforce Flow app. I'll just refresh this because we must drop the connection at some point. There we are. So I've got my app here that I've created. I've installed it into my org. And if I go into the configuration here of the app, it's literally a Slack app that I've built and connected to Salesforce. Look for a second. And actually, we're going to go into a different tab. With me. So my apps, I have my Salesforce Flow app that I've created. And if we go into here, you can see here I have my app, all of my credentials that are blurred out here, my tokens, and all of the information about the app, all of the permissions as well. We can view it all in the app's manifest. And so here you can scope out what your Slack app can do. So for example, here, my bot is allowed to read channels, read history, write to chat, etc. And what this actually does is allow you to create the Slack app and distribute it globally as well. So for example, this app that I'm creating is going to be published to the App Exchange. I can then publish this app to the Slack directory. And every time someone installs it, it will automatically be connected to their Salesforce org when they do that initial authentication because of the way that it's mapped to the Slack metadata. And if we take a look inside, back in the project over here, inside of that Slack app's metadata file, you can see here, did I get a message? I should probably mute myself. We can define that in our Salesforce project. And so I'm hoping no one will steal my secrets here. I will rotate them before it's published. But you just set this up in the Slack app's metadata, and it knows that every time it's pushed, it can communicate there. Okay. And so, go ahead and close that out. I think I hide this.
Move it away.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. It's there. Cool. Okay. So now that we've defined that, let's go ahead and look at that event handler. So I've namespaced them all myself because I'm very OCD about my naming conventions, especially when something's going into a package. But what we have here is a Slack event handler class that extends the Slack.event dispatcher class that we now provide in Apex. And when that's received, we can then take in that event's parameters and the request context so that we know where that transaction, which Slack org that's coming from. And then we create a runnable handler here that runs every time that event is received. And so in this case, I'm trying to make a very generic app that just listens to some messages and lets you trigger a flow. What we're going to do is go ahead and get the context of our Slack app here. So this is the Slack app file, aptly called Slacktions, that we can then use to instantiate the Slack app. We can then instantiate a bot as well to get the team ID, and then we can go and get that event that's been published. So whether that be the message event that we created, whether that be the member join channel event, we can grab that, and then we can cast it as need be. So in this case, what I'm doing here is instantiating a platform event that we're going to fire with the messages context. That way admins can subscribe to these platform events from their flow. Okay, so just to take a step back, because we are getting into some really complicated territory here in what I've built and am demoing. Every time an event is fired from Slack, I want to take the context of that event and fire a platform event so that we can subscribe to it from Flow or from Apex classes. And that way you're not having to rewrite an event handler every time you want to then pull an event from Slack. You can just add it into the context of what's happening here. Now, there are some complications. You can see here that we're going to switch on the type of the event. And so we've assigned it as our message event, member join channel event, member left channel event, only because we actually have to cast the event to the class itself based on the type of event it is, so that we know what we can gain access to as far as the parameters from the event go, because the message event is going to have different properties to the member join channel event, which will have different properties to the reaction event. And so in that sense, you then have a class for each specific type of event that you can cast in Apex. And then you can go and, for example, in the message event, get the channel, get the user, get the team, get the text. Or in this case, there is no text in the member join channel event. Or in the reaction event, there's an emoji that you need to go and get. And so here in the reaction event, we can go and get that reaction. And what it's doing is it's assigning those values to the platform event and then publishing it here. And so if I open up the dev console here in Salesforce, let's take a look at what this looks like. And so you can see we've got our Slack runtime here in Apex that's run. Make that a bit bigger for you. And if we open up the, let's see, right here, let's open up the raw logs. You can see here, we have that event that's been fired. That's then assigned those values. So we've got the channel ID, the Slack user ID, the team ID, the body of that message here, hello from the meeting, as that's come through. We take a look at this log here. We should see the raw event as it comes through. Yep. And so here's the raw message event as it comes from Slack before we do the casting. And so you can see it's passing in the team, the channel, the user. A lot of this we won't need, but I've tried to pull out the bits that we do for the platform event so that we can subscribe to them in Flow. So like, for example, we don't really need to know if it was rich text that was submitted versus whether it was not in this instance. But all of this does come through, and when you cast into the event type, you can call the method to get this information from the message as it comes through. Now, what I've done here is actually, what is the tab through? There it is. I've created a series of flow, like for example, this message example flow that will allow you to subscribe to that platform event here. So first off, we've got a platform event triggered flow that's listening to that action handler event that I'm firing as a platform event. I can then determine whether or not it's the right type of message. And so I can say, is the action a message? And if it is, I can do something. And my idea was, okay, what would we want to do with this message? Maybe copy it to Chatter. And so all I've done is got the related opportunity to the Slack channel that I've assigned, and I'm copying that message to Chatter, taking whatever the body of that message is and posting it on the opportunity Chatter feed. And so in that case, if I go back here, I should have a message. So I have that hello from meeting message here that's posted to Chatter. It's a very simple use case, but I'm sure you can think of many different ways that you can then hook this up into Salesforce. Now, if we have the reaction event, I was having some issues with this earlier because I've added a namespace to it after building it, which everyone here should know that we should never do. So we've got our namespace there. We are active. And so if I add a reaction to this, and the reaction is the white check mark, it should take this now and create a task against that opportunity based on that checkbox. And so if I go back into Slack and I go ahead and add a reaction here, let's add the white check mark. Okay, it should take that. I've not had a vibration on my phone, so that's not, there isn't a Slack error message or a Flow error message. Back into Salesforce, which is here, and the opportunity, we should have a task. Let's go ahead and refresh that. And we do. So there's a Slack opportunity task that I've created. And by adding that reaction to the message, I have some text that has not created properly because I've probably not added the namespace back into the flow. However, it did create the task there and shows you how you can react in Salesforce to those types of actions. Okay. Now, when it comes to actually posting something into Salesforce, we can do that in the same way with our team ID that we have, as well as that channel. And so we can do that directly from Apex by instantiating a bot. And so if we go back into here, I'll close this down, and wrong project. If we open up here, I've created a send formatted message here. Let's see, oh no, there's my demo component. Okay, so here's a demo class that I've created where we have a team ID and a channel ID. You can store this in your org, or you can get it from the context. So when the transaction is initiated from Slack, the team ID and channel ID are passed in to the transaction. If you're initiating the transaction from Salesforce, you do need to have the team ID and the channel ID that you want to send it to saved somewhere. So in this instance, I'm going to go back into the dev console here and go and get those. And so here we've got our team ID here. And let's go ahead and put that into Salesforce. Let's rearrange for a second. Okay, so let's put our team ID there. And let's get our channel ID there. Okay. I then have here, we're instantiating our app. And then what we're doing is creating a bot client. And that bot client allows you to perform actions based on what permissions you've given it. And so if we go back into that definition here, you can see here are all of the permissions that I've given the bot. So they can read, they can write against channels, they can send messages, etc. Okay, and that's defined at the top level of that parent app. But if we go then into where are we here? I'm instantiating the bot client. I'm getting a view reference, which is what I said earlier about there being that block kit example. And then we can send a post message request to actually build that message using a builder pattern, get the channel ID, get the reference, build it, and then create it. So we have our bot client that we've instantiated, and we can run a post message request that will send a message to Slack from your Salesforce org. Now, posting a message is just one thing. You can create the channels, you can add people to channels, you can pin records, you can do anything from there right here using that bot client itself in Apex. And this doesn't have to be in Slack context. You can put this into any of your Apex classes, any of your code. I've written a lot of invocable actions using stuff like this because it makes a really cool way to integrate Slack and Salesforce. And so let's go ahead and deploy this real quick. And let's go then into, actually, why don't we just do it this way? Run anonymous Apex. Can we? Unless I don't have that. There we go. So execute anonymous Apex with selected text. When we run this, we should, as you've heard, maybe have a Slack message. And so in that channel, you can see here from Apex, I've posted that message. Hello, here's a message from Apex without having to start the transaction in Slack. So whether or not a user is authenticated into Slack, you can initiate those messages here. Now, this message here is ran and formatted using that block kit. And so if we go back into here, we can see we've got that demo view that we're getting and instantiating. In Apex, I then have my view definitions here. Oh, there we are. And here I've got that demo view that I've just created. And it uses YAML to just format out a message. So you've got the top level message that you're defining, the header, you're then giving that some text. You've got the section, and we can say, here is the message. Now, these view definitions are incredibly powerful. Okay, to take this to the next level, there's a concept called data providers. And so you can provide data from Salesforce via an Apex class right into your view definition. Okay, now before everyone gets incredibly confused, so I've written an app that allows you to take auto-launched flows and render them in the Slack UI. So if we go into Salesforce and take a look at what that configuration looks like, I have an app here called Slacktions, because that's a great name for an app. And in here, I've got a launch flow shortcut builder. And what this does is it allows you to define a flow that you would like to make available in Slack. And so if we press new here, we can give it a name. Let's say update opportunity stage. And say test. And then we can select any of our auto launch flows that we have in Salesforce. And what that will do is give us all of the input properties that you've set up as variables inside of your flow and allow you to select an input type. Now, what we want to be able to do is take these record definitions against our flows and transpile them into Slack UI in a modal so that you can select your flow and it will show you how to do whatever you need to do. And so, for example, this one's interesting because you need to be able to look up an opportunity. And so we can select the input type here of a lookup. We can then select the S-object type that we would like here. So we've got an opportunity, and then we can select the field that we would like to pass into that input parameter. And in this case, we want the opportunity ID. Okay. Other types that are available are lookups, pick lists, the Slack user ID, or the Slack Salesforce, the Slack user's Salesforce ID. And in this case, we've got the stage here. We actually want to just pass in a pick list. And so once again, we can select the S-object type. And then we can select the field that we want. So let's say the stage, and we can save it. Okay, I have two of these now that do the exact same thing, but there we are. So we've got those here set up inside of the org. Now I want to take this and make these available inside of Slack. And so that's where we have a shortcut. And so inside of our app here, so let's take a step back and let's go into the Slack. I understand I'm talking very fast. There's a lot going on here. And this is the first time that a lot of you are probably seeing anything remotely like this, as well as most of the world. There's a lot to go through here. So here we have a global shortcut called launch flow. And that points us to an Apex class called Slack_launch flow. It's prefixed with Apex action because that's what's generated when you're actually creating the Slack app. And so that's how you have to reference it and point to it. And it launches a flow from Salesforce that we've defined. Okay, now what's inside of this class is actually code that will create a modal for us. And so if we go into our Apex classes here and go into our Slack and Launch Flow class here, what we're going to do is take our action handler that takes in our shortcuts parameters, which gives us the context of where we're launching this from. And then we have a modal view that we're instantiating, and we're going to call it. And what it's going to do is pass in our flow selector reference and display it. That's all we're doing here. When you click the shortcut, it's going to create a modal, and it's just going to go and get that view reference and render it. Now, what's happening in the view reference is where the cool stuff is really. And so here we have our shortcut flow selector. We have some properties that we can define. So we can pass in a title and a channel ID. And so these are available for input into the modal window itself. And then we have our data provider, which is our flow definitions. And what that does is it allows us to call an Apex class here, which is our shortcut handler, and get a list of those flow definitions. And all that's sitting behind this is a SOQL query that's going to pass us a list of flows. From there, we can then render them. And so here we have an input that allows us to select the flow that we'd like to run, and it's going to get all of those flow definitions here from that data provider coming from Apex. And so this way, when that's rendered in Slack, we can query directly into Salesforce and display that data to our user. And so if we go into this app here and we run our shortcut, let's go to our launch Salesforce flow shortcut. And there it's done and gone and rendered that pick list and given us a list of those flows. There's the one we just created. There's the one that was already in existence. Now, where the cool stuff happens is when I click that flow, even cooler stuff, it's going to take all of those field definitions and it's going to wrap them around the input parameters in Slack in that view definition and allow us to bind queries to our Slack UI. And so, for example, we have that opportunity here called, ship it. I can query Salesforce here in my input field. And it's going to give me that opportunity. However, if I'd selected the account in the lookup definition there, so for example, if we go into here and I go and view my definitions, let's go to the one we just created. Here, just stored as data in Salesforce, I've got my lookup against the opportunity ID. I've got a pick list against the stage name. It's passing these values into the Slack UI and rendering the lookup based off of that and some incredibly generic data provider code. And so if I go into my data provider here, so it is called, so into that first that view definition here, we've got 3 different data providers. We've got our lookup variables, our pick list variables, and our free text variables. So for example, to put that into context here, we have a lookup that's being rendered. Here we have a pick list that's being rendered, and I don't have any free text rendered in this component itself. But so we're going to go and get what those variables look like here, and we're just going to pass in the record ID of those properties, and it's going to go and query those. And so if we go and look at what that shortcut definition looks like here, in Slack, we've got our shortcut handler to that class. So here's get our flow definition lookup variables. Once again, SOQL. We're just running a SOQL query to go and get the lookups from this class so that we can get the SObject type, the field name, and the label override here. Okay, and then when we go back into our view definition, which is here, shortcut flow view, we can then iterate over that response. And so here we have our lookup variables. Inside of our view definition, we have an iteration of our lookup variables here that we're going and getting from Apex. And we're just iterating over an input where we can select whatever that item is. And then it's actually passing another binding here into the component. And this is what's called an external lookup against Salesforce. And it allows you to point an Apex class at that search box. And so in here, when we're typing up the opportunity name, it's running this Apex class that's defined here that says to get record by name and passes in the SObject type and the field name so that it knows where to look and what to respond with. So in this case, we need to pass in an opportunity name, and it's going to pass us back an opportunity ID based off of what we've defined here. We've got our opportunity and we're going to respond with an ID. I'm sorry, in the type, sorry, that's not showing here. There we are. So our field name that is going to return as an ID, and we're going to look it up there. Same thing with the pick list values. We've got a very generic data provider here for pick lists. And so here's our pick list variables, and we're then passing in the options into that property, Slack options. And so that way we're able to create an unbelievably generic UI in Slack that's being driven fully by that Salesforce config and data, which really shows how powerful this SDK is, because I can now click that opportunity and mark it as closed. Here, closed one. Doesn't look what I did there. Closed one and submit it. I have not tested this recently, so we will see if this works. And it's going to run and submit those properties into the flow, and it's just going to cast them into the flow that's been defined by its developer name. And so fingers crossed, this opportunity should be updated as closed one. And it hasn't been. And so do I have a flow breaking email? No, it hasn't been. The big finish didn't work. However, I think you get the idea there in what it's trying to do. See if quickly I can debug this. So developer name. I'm not passing in the namespace, so I need to go and update my namespace to code. However, I think the real magic is in that you can dynamically render all of that data in Slack and do all of that just by creating a shortcut and providing those data providers here in the view definition. Okay, and that is all I have to show.
Did you write all of that code using / commands from Slack?
Which code?
The VS Code lookup. Did you have a translator to where you can write a / command and have it generate code inside of VS Code?
No.
No, so you did it the easy way with VS Code and just type in your code like regular?
Yeah, I just wrote the code.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, that's still very, very cool.
Yeah. So all of it's written by hand, I guess. If that's what you're saying. Do we have sound coming from the audience? I see a couple of hands raised. Oh, lots of chat. Oh, yeah.
A moment only available when you click the shortcut, or can you have it happen? Like if I type a message.
Yeah.
Let's just say it's very long.
Yeah.
Can I make a modal pop up and say, hey, before you submit it, you need to write a subject?
No. Yeah. No. You'd have to instantiate the message from an action or a / command.
So, Zushil, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, I think
you have the HDMI, so therefore I don't have audio. It should be coming through that though. No, he's talking, but we can't hear
Let's see
him.
what happens if I unmute.
My question is about the code which Stephan shared. So is it available in GitHub, or we have to buy a license, then only we can access on this functionality?
Say it again.
The code which you demoed here, is it available in the GitHub, it's published in the GitHub, or we have to buy a license, then only we can access this code?
So it's going to be in beta in the summer. It's currently not available to customers. However, there will not be a license. This will be included in all orders. Summer. Oh, yeah.
All right, hopefully you can hear Stephan now.
So the beta will be in the summer. It's not currently available. However, there won't be an additional license for it. It will just be part of your standard Salesforce licenses. As it currently stands, I don't know if those plans have changed, but that is where I'm aware at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Stephan?
Stephan, regarding the debugging, are there any kind of specific challenges that you saw or observed while debugging any of the code that kind of interact with the Slack and platform events and Slack events?
Yeah, very much so. This is a product that is not even in beta yet. And so we are still working on surfacing error messages correctly in a lot of cases. And I probably would not have been able to get to this level without being able to have direct access to lookup gags.
Gotcha.
There are still some challenges there, but as we get through and work through those bugs, it should be really, really elegant when it comes to that. It's worth noting that there is already a full testing suite for this. And so, for example, if I go into Apex, we can test everything. So for example, launching the flow, we can actually simulate the creation of the Slack channel, creating the users, everything, and then actually go through and in our test, launch the modal, interact with the fields, set properties, and make sure that everything works. And so for example, we can set the inputs, we can check that they're working properly, we can submit modals, etc. And so there is a full testing suite along with these as well.
Awesome, thank you.
If you want to package it, you've got to have code coverage.
Exactly, that's true.
And like someone said, Apex and other metadata used to run the Slack app project published. I'm going to be publishing it on GitHub as well as in a managed package in a couple of months' time. So just keep your eyes peeled for when that becomes available. But the idea of this project is that it's all open.
Did you check your chats?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got the chat open.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any other questions for Stephan?
It's worth noting, if anyone is going to be at Southeast Dreamin', I'm doing a hands-on workshop on this, in which you may get an org to play with for the day. Run the Apex SDK. I'll be there for doing a hands-on workshop and then a couple of talks.
Yeah, one of two people in the audience. Do you have any questions? Sorry to put you on the spot. Don't feel like you need to.
Cool.
Great. Lots of hands-on if you're here in person. So.
Yeah, great. Well, that is all that I had here. So I don't know if we want to continue on. Just some resources. Check out developer.salesforce.com. We've just released lots of release content. And so we were hard at work putting together lots of blogs and release readiness live the last couple of weeks. And so that's all been published. Follow our Salesforce devs Twitter handle for the latest information. And our team are constantly publishing content to the Salesforce developers YouTube channel, in which there is lots of great video content for you to enjoy.
Excellent. There on our channel as well. So.
Yep, and that's it for me there.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, yeah, both of us clapping is. Thank you very much, Stephan. Yeah, if there's no other questions, May, do you have anything for us as we close out?
I wanna thank everyone, and I wanna thank Stephan for joining us today. And honestly, if anybody asks me, have you ever seen future? Today, I'm gonna say yes, I've seen future, like at least a couple of months forward. So thank you for sharing the Slack tricks with us, and we'll keep an eye out on the documentation, and whether it becomes GA, I'd love to take it for a spin. Thank you so much.
I mean, just to get some feedback, this is one of the coolest things, right? It's crazy, absolutely crazy that Salesforce have been able to do this.
Yeah, this is quick and tight.
Yeah.
I'm looking at some of my other ideas that are out there still waiting to be done and see, this is an amazing level of integration with Slack and capabilities. So there's obviously some investment in that power.
Yeah.
I get it too. I had a good talk with Tim Alexander last week, who's written kind of a middling pull data into Slack from other sources. And I'm looking forward to the discussion we have about how to keep Slack from turning into junk like Outlook, like email, because email and messaging all have to do, as soon as people figure out how to spam it and automate it, they start to poison the channel. So Slack's not that much different. So hopefully we go forward eyes open and make sure that it's a pull channel and you're allowed to request things and you make those easily available as opposed to from the other direction and sending just too much data and it'll be yet another thing people ignore. So
that'll be a fun conversation to see how those develop. Thank you very much again for that. Thank you everybody for joining. Good stuff, and we will see you next month with CPQ Dev.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Bob.
Great
Shout out to you for managing the hybrid session. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.